Alliance and about what they're all about. So, and we're recording this now, by the way.
Thank you.
So anyway, FIDO really is a pretty basic theme, which is the elimination of passwords as we know it. And as you'll learn today from our guests, they're all involved around the globe with all the biggest vendor names and organizations that you can imagine at promulgating their approach to the elimination of the password and moving forward in identity and identification and authentication technology. So Christina is, as I believe, the executive director, chief operating officer. David will explain his role, but without further ado, I will just pass it on over to David, and just with our thanks for being here today and helping educate us all on what you're doing and how this could relate to the work that we're doing in both the healthcare and the human services fields. So thank you, David. I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you for the great introduction, Ed. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Everyone see that okay?
Yep, that's great.
Great. So you've introduced Christina. I'm the Director of Standards Development. I oversee the creation development of technical work items within the FIDO Alliance, and as well have active involvement with our engagements with other liaisons and international standards bodies like ISO and ITUT. So no surprise, this group's going to understand it. There's problems with authentication. Things are getting stolen, broken in, untrusted, malware. It's a host of problems. Don't really need to educate you on that. Phishing has been going up steadily, massive spike in 2020, but you can see the trend, it's still going up. So it's fundamentally a problem. I heard a great quote not long ago, crooks don't hack into your site, they log into your site. I mean, it's the most common way of taking over someone's information or somebody's account. We know passwords are fundamentally broken. They're very clumsy, hard to remember. There's all sorts of ways of stealing them, reusing them, and even imitating them because of poor choice of passwords 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, password 1, those sorts of things. So they're incredibly vulnerable and fragile things. We have solutions like SMS and one-time passwords for security. The problem with those, while I will emphasize they are absolutely better than just password. So, as a bare minimum, even this level of second factor authentication is always a minimum desirable thing. They are still phishable in lots of different ways, whether it's man-in-the-middle attacks, whether it's hacked, your device has got malware on it, whatever. These are all vulnerable. The common ones are still very vulnerable to phishing attacks, even large-scale ones. So this is where FIDO comes in. In the industry, we've had a lot of options available for two-factor for a while, but they tended to be either poor usability, especially when you have to copy and get a code from your phone, type it into your app, those sorts of things, or you had to carry around dongles with numbers, which you then had to enter in, or in some cases use a smart card, which required a specialized smart card reader. And so the ability to improve security tended to be hindered by its usability. So this made a fundamental focus of FIDO, one of creating new standards that are simpler and stronger for authentication using public key cryptography. Some key focuses or goals were single gesture, some kind of possession-based model, which I'll explain in a little while, and then that are phishing resistant. So this combination makes the alternative, that is FIDO over other second factor options, simpler and more trustworthy, even to protect against phishing attacks. So what are we? We're an industry association. and our focus is on developing authentication standards and certification, which I'll also talk about, market adoption programs, and our goal is to reduce the dependency on passwords. We're well on our way to doing that. There's still work to go, but we're seeing a lot of traction towards this, especially in the last couple of years. This screen of logos represents the FIDO board of directors. You'd be hard pressed to find some industry, major, tech industry, not represented by what's on this screen right now. We've got platform vendors, silicon vendors, financial institutions, service providers, infrastructure vendors, hardware vendors. We've got people covering the whole scope of products and services that are in use today. There's 40, I can't add them up in my head, I think 43 on our board right now. And in addition to that, we've got sponsor members, associate members, and a lot of quite a few liaison members. So in total, correct me if I'm wrong, Christina, we're somewhere above 250 members total right now. So in addition to all the logos that you see here, we have substantial backing from a lot of other organizations that are interested in getting rid of passwords and helping create industry standards for strong authentication. Following what I just said, here is a growing list of those who are actually deploying FIDO. There are obviously more than that, but these are some that particularly get people's attention. We have governments in there. We have financial service providers. We have shopping sites, mobile operators, healthcare services, all who have adopted FIDO as an authentication protocol for their sites. So how does FIDO work? So in the existing world, when someone logs in, it's them and the site. And that creates this big hole in the middle where there's lots of opportunities for phishing and stealing passwords. What FIDO does is it introduces this notion of an authenticator. And the idea of the authenticator is that it becomes the device or the thing that logs in with the service provider or the relying party. And it does so by creating a key pair. So for each user with their authenticator, they'll create a unique public and private key for each service that they connect to. The benefit of that is that you can't then track a user across multiple sites because the key pairs can't be compared. So if I use one to log into my CVS account, I use another one to log into GitHub, can't imagine why they would end up trying to collude, but they wouldn't be able to because I've got a unique set of credentials for each one. Now, a key part of creating these keys is that the user must always be involved. And this is one of the ways that we thwart some of the different types of malware attacks. It means that in order for the authenticator to even create the key pair, the user has to make some kind of gesture. In some cases, it's just like in a two-factor scenario, it's just touching the key. They often have a capacitive touch button on them. In other cases, it may be the use of biometrics or it may be the use of a PIN to unlock the authenticator in registration to create the key pair. And then during authentication, when the relying party or service provider sends a challenge, so you're trying to log in, the site sends the challenge back to the authenticator then prompts the user to acknowledge that this has been requested. So again, the authenticator can't just blindly respond. It always requires a user interaction. And again, it could just be a touch, could be a PIN, could be biometric. Once the user has indicated their consent or they've done their gesture, then the challenge is signed by the private key. That's sent back to the relying party, and they use the public key to confirm that, yes, this is the challenge I sent, and yes, it was created by the matching, the private key that matches the public key that they've got. By working this way, it means that you can't, the phishing attack won't work because they won't have the right public-private key. And actually a piece that's not indicated here is that a part of the registration, I should modify this slide for that, binds the key pair to the name of the relying party, the domain name of the relying party. So if a phishing site comes in and they've spelled Google with 2 zeros instead of 2 O's, the authenticator is going to reject that because the credential it has is for Google with 2 O's, not 2 zeros. So if you're going to a site that's been spoofed, this is one of the ways in which FIDO has an extra layer of protection to make sure that you can't get hacked in that kind of scenario. Now, for this crowd, for a lot of consumer scenarios, this piece isn't necessarily, it really isn't as important. But when you start talking about high value transactions, whether they're financial or for high value personal information, such as in healthcare, then the notion of attestation may become an important factor. The idea here is that every FIDO authenticator, so the hardware that creates those keys, also comes with an attestation credential, another key pair, and the credential is for that authenticator is also stored in a metadata service that FIDO provides. And what this means is that the relying party can get the information when someone's registering from the authenticator, including its attestation. It can then do a lookup on the attestation and verify that that is an authentic key from that manufacturer that it claims to be. So this helps protects against fake keys, but it also contains extra information about the type of crypto used and any certification that it might have passed, so that the service provider can then do an evaluation as to whether or not they want to accept that key. So it provides an extra bump to raise the level of security and assurance that you can set when you're using a FIDO authenticator. Now, all of this stuff is great, but as you well know in your own industry, certification really, really matters. People can make all sorts of claims, they can put all sorts of stuff on the market. How do you trust it? Well, a big part of the FIDO ecosystem is its certification process. And at the first level, we provide conformance and interoperability testing. And this is a way to assure that primarily the servers, the part running on the relying party, meet all of the specification requirements for any of the different FIDO protocols that are currently in use. And so it's a way for, say, a vendor selling a FIDO server product, or even a relying party who's built their own, to make sure that they have something that's compliant and compatible with any for any FIDO service that or any authenticator and client that they may run into in the wild. The next level of certification has to do with the authenticators themselves. Based on security needs, you can have different levels of requirements for how much assurance you want in the authenticator device itself. The L1, so essentially it's all about how do you protect the private key. In L1, that's the most basic level, and that's where you generally use something like white box cryptography to protect the keys in software. You may also use some hardware, but it's primarily a software-based solution. Level 2 is all about using hardware as the means for creating and storing the keys. And then level 3, you start getting up into hardened hardware where you're protecting against physical attacks on the authenticator. There are very few devices that are certified at that level, but we do have some. So, and this is all done by third-party laboratories who are certified by us, and typically have passed, I never remember the ISO numbers, but they're certified at, there's certain ISO standards for testing laboratories, and they've been certified at that level as well. To complement that, and this is somewhat parallel or to the side of what we do at FIDO, but we don't define any hardware relating to biometrics, but as I mentioned earlier, biometrics can be used as the way to unlock authenticators. So it turned out there was a gap in biometric device testing. So the testing of fingerprint readers with a FIDO authenticator, or face recognition, or iris scanning. And so we've created a parallel certification program that actually tests, again, through certified laboratories, that tests the biometrics for various criteria, false acceptance, false reject, and so on. And so a vendor who produces a biometric tool can actually have it validated by itself, but we've got at least one or two vendors who have actually certified their hardware at level 2 and have certified the biometrics. So they've got high degree of assurance that it is a highly secure biometric FIDO authenticator. So they don't have to be used together, but when they do, they provide a vendor with a very high standard for their product. FIDO is now supported cross-platform. It's supported on all the major operating systems, in all the major browsers. So you basically can't get a device today that doesn't support FIDO, which means that it's essentially ubiquitous. It's a ubiquitous set of features or functions integrated into all platforms and browsers. So if anybody wants to build a FIDO solution, they can now reliably assume that their users are going to be on a platform that supports FIDO. I've heard someone do a kind of back of the napkin calculation that means there's somewhere north of 4 billion devices that currently support FIDO.
Hey, David, that's
Yes.
a lot of devices.
Yes.
Hey, we didn't talk about if there are questions that are coming along the way. And so Pooja is talking about a NIST related question. I don't know. I want to ask if it's a good time to should we hold those or?
Oh, I'm happy to take them as we go.
Oh, great. Okay, I think we've got time. We just want to manage the time that you've got available.
Sure.
Great. So. Pooja,
Yeah, I can ask it live.
Yeah.
So David, this is really helpful. So I'm actually very familiar with this because when we launched EPCS with Dr. First, we had to kind of figure out what was approved and not approved for physicians. And I know I've recently been chatting with folks, and the goal was, it would be great for physicians to be able to use the biometrics that are now being incorporated into their EHRs. And my understanding is nothing was officially approved. So I don't know if that's changed now that you've done some of the work around that. So I'm just curious.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with who has actually gone through the program.
Okay.
But certainly it's not just for FIDO hardware vendors. This can be applied by, or the certification can be run against any biometric device provider. So certainly your vendors could be directed to this, and I can, if you want, I can connect them up with our director of certification, Ray Rivera.
Okay, yeah, I guess my question was, it sounds like you can now use biometrics to send EPCS prescriptions, kind of based on what you said, that you have your certification. So I was just curious if you guys have worked with NIST at all to get that updated, because I think the last time I looked, the biometrics were still not being allowed for EPCS. So that's why I was just trying to.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'm sorry.
No worries. No worries. Thanks.
I will point out though that the people who developed the biometric certification requirements are deeply involved in this industry and have actively developed not only our requirements documents, but also have contributed directly to some of the key ISO specs that relate to this.
Okay, great. And I think actually Jim probably clarified my question. So, which is it FIPS 140-2 compliant? I think that is the real question. That
is an interesting question. I don't know.
Okay.
I like that question.
I think that's what it needs to be for EPCS too. So,
okay,
hey, great. Sorry, didn't mean to
That's
interrupt.
okay.
Could I ask you, or David, can you, for us mere mortals, can you describe a little bit about FIPS 142 compliance? Just a headline on that. Is that like?
Yeah, it's a federal information processing standard. It's a certification process that certifies the cryptography and algorithms for authentication solutions.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, actually, I'll have to
Yeah.
look into that.
Cool.
Yes.
Well, I know that I'm going to hold to my questions because I want to get even further afield from healthcare in a moment, but continue on unless anyone
Okay.
else has questions.
So Fido's working, in fact, has gotten to the point where we're becoming a key part of the web DNA. We're becoming an integral part of what people are building and using on the web. We've got core industry standardization and collaboration, both in terms of our work with the W3C, as well as our work within ISO and ITUT. We're shipping in devices at scale, as I mentioned in the last slide. And then what I'm about to cover is we've also achieved a high degree of awareness and even formal recognition within the regulatory and government space. So one of the key, we actually have a policy working group within Fido, and its focus and its intent is to look at this huge number of governance policies and regulations around the world. And we tend to get involved at in an interactive way when possible, more from an education standpoint, to help them understand as they're writing their documents that, what's the difference between a phishable two-factor authentication and non-phishable two-factor authentication. And we've been working especially closely with, say, the US federal government recently to get them to make that distinction clear so that we can actually raise the bar on requirements for two-factor authentication. But we've had active engagement with all of the different organizations and many policy documents that have been developed by these organizations. And we've even got formal recognition from a number of them where more and more Fido is being mentioned by name when they're talking about higher levels or higher levels of assurance for authentication. So I've talked about the standards we've done. We've got certification and our governance and regulatory work, but we're also focused on trying to get adoption increased. So we've actually put a heavy focus on user guidance. One of the challenges is that the user experience of a password, other than the forgettability and stuff, is actually pretty straightforward because people know it. They type in their name, they type in their password, especially if they got a password manager, it's pretty straightforward. The whole notion of two-factor authentication is a new concept to most people, and it's a stumbling block. And while using Fido as a two-factor auth isn't necessarily any harder, in fact, in many cases it's much easier, it's still a new concept. People still have to be led through the process. And so we've actually done a great deal of formal research and formal consumer testing on usability and best practices for how we can make this more accessible and more usable to consumers. In the enterprise environment, it's a little easier, largely because you can just tell your employees, use it, and you can provide formal training when necessary. In the consumer space, of course, it's much harder. You get people, as soon as they hit any kind of friction, they turn around, they walk away, they go do something else. And so getting the user experience right has become one of our big focuses as well. And we've produced a number of case studies, and we've gotten some, as I said, data-driven and actual test-led research into usability and even things like terminology. What are the types of terms and such that would resonate with users? It turns out that I think it's the term password free is not a good term for a lot of consumers, because that apparently many have assumed means no password and therefore less secure. So it's quite interesting sometimes the things that you learn when you go through this. Now, just to talk about some adjacent areas of work at Fido, probably of less interest, well, one will be less interest, one probably of more interest. The first is authentication. That's where we're spending all our time now. But two adjacent areas have to do with identity verification, which I realized, as I said, no, is probably of great interest to you. This is an area of certified testing that we're developing as well to help test identity verification processes that depend on what they call selfie matching. Take a photo of some kind of credential from an authoritative source, driver's license, passport, employee ID, that has a picture. The document is validated, and then the user takes a selfie of themselves, and then that picture is compared to the driver's license. There are a lot of products out there that do this. The problem is that there's no standard for them. There's no bar to say this one's good, this one's bad. How often does it pass? How often does it fail? And so what FIDO is doing, much like we did with biometrics, is building a set of requirements for testing, document authentication, and the face verification in the context of this selfie matching. And we're just starting our proof of concept testing for the document authentication part, and we're still developing the requirements for the face verification part. The second area is actually in IoT device onboarding. I'm sure many of you have heard about all the nightmare scenarios of IoT devices being shipped with default username passwords, which then get hacked, or they've got built-in, the same key is built into every device. Lots of nightmare scenarios, and the cost and time of onboarding devices, especially in industrial and manufacturing environments, is very high if a user has to touch every single one of them. And so we've developed a specification that creates essentially a no-touch secure onboarding mechanism for IoT devices. So FIDO in healthcare, it is an area that we've got some experience or familiarity with. Both the Caron Alliance and HISAC are liaison partners with the FIDO Alliance. And we've had a number of information exchanges. We've had quite a few presentations from the Caron Alliance about what they're doing with authentication. And it's actually a great area of interest within the FIDO Alliance, and what they've presented in the past has been quite interesting. We had what we called our liaison week just last December past, and we had a great presentation from Health ISAC as well about what they're doing and how, again, there can be synergies between their work and what we're doing with FIDO. So to just wrap up, kind of restating all the things, stronger, faster, private, are all really core underpinnings of what we're doing at FIDO. Convenient, making it easy to use and having it integrated into all devices is very important. The support by the browsers is critical, that it's backed by the industry and that it's in the market today. These are all key aspects of what we've done with FIDO and what we're continuing to do with FIDO. So with that, I thank you. Went through a little faster than I thought, which I think is okay. And now I'll open to questions.
Awesome.
David, I'm sorry, Daniel, do you have a question?
No, I was just applauding. I thought it was a great presentation and it's really exciting to hear. That's all. So I got really interested in the conversation we're going to have coming forward. It sounds like there's an amazing momentum and the savior is on the way. Passport will be released from password hell in our lifetime. That will be a great thing if we could live through that, boy. What a legacy not to pass on to the next generation. As we started the conversation around the Jetsons earlier, it's like the 2.0, bring it back with no password. So off to you, Matt. What are you thinking?
Well, I guess, David, I'm a big fan of the technology, and we use it internally in OpenSea Labs. So I guess the first question is, are there kind of limitations on how this could be implemented for people who are like low income, or they don't have a smartphone, or they, or I guess you could do two-factor, like you could have a single-factor text, right? I guess, or an app on your phone if you have a smartphone. But is there some thinking going into essentially ensuring that there is some users with less resources or less availability, can better equally leverage this technology, or how
That's a great
would
question.
an organization considering those users implement the technology to make sure that those users aren't excluded?
I'm afraid I don't have a great answer to that. If I'm not mistaken, Christine can confirm this, I actually think that was a topic that was raised within the board for future consideration recently, as to how to deal with, I never remember what the right term is, but markets that are
Right.
less established and
I mean, even in like a healthcare market. So the Karen Alliance model of an identity is you prove your identity once, you come in with your driver's license, you prove who you are, right? They capture it in a digital credential. And then every time you come back, you re-access the, you don't have to show your driver's license each time. You come back and it's verified and sent across systems for interoperability. But Karen would find the same challenges for, illegal immigrants or people without access to technology. So that was just one of my questions.
access to, oh, go ahead, Christina.
I was just going to say, this pops up on a fairly regular basis in discussions, both within the working groups and at the board level. And it's something that has been flagged as an area that we really should think about consciously, as opposed to it just being kind of an afterthought in some of the work that we're doing. So yeah, underserved markets, people who don't possess cell phones, smartphones is another example of that. It's definitely something we're looking at and plays into the whole aspect of FIDO in terms of making sure that there is usability. And David mentioned the UX work that we're looking at, making sure that the user experience is robust enough that everybody can use it. But another more recent discussion that has kicked off is diversity and inclusion. So making sure that we have that ability to serve all aspects of the population. So it's a high level answer. We don't have any specifics right now, but it's certainly something that we're looking into and will be an area of focus in the next 2 to 3 years. So David, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, no.
I would just add in David and Christina's defense, though, that I have found the challenge in mobile identity and digital identity is that you have, in empirical terms, a large number of people that don't have digital identities or have challenges with access to digital identities. In terms of access to mobile devices, it's still like around 8% of the population. And I use an anecdote from my colleague at IBM. And he was trying to make a presentation, and I think it was Kenya. I'll just throw out Kenya as an example, sub-Saharan Africa. And the health ministers just dismissed his concerns about providing paper credentials and this sort of thing, because he said everybody's got a cell phone. So mobile penetration it really is a point where I think I would just offer that we have to look hard at the amount of effort that FIDO or anyone else has to do to address usability among a non-mobile population when mobile penetration on a global basis is so high, even if they lack defined digital identities.
It's higher in many countries in Africa than it is in the United States. So.
Bet you the service is better than Long Island. I always tell people I feel like I'm living in a developing country here on the island.
I think I'm trying to connect the dots between FIDO and Karen, because FIDO is concerned with the authentication component, whereas Karen is concerned with the identity proofing component. Am I really the Matt Bishop, that presents, or if there's multiple Matt Bishops and I'm presenting at a hospital, you want to make sure you're not pulling the wrong records. So I'm not, it's obviously the problem is a lot more complex than any one standard can solve, but that's why I wanted to bring those two things together.
So before does anyone else have another question? I have a couple of thoughts I wanted to share, but I want to make sure people are.
So I'll just note that looks like Jim posted something about FIDO with relation to verifiable credentials, and I'll just note that it's in our roadmap of things to look at in our in the near future for where there may be synergy and opportunity to find some ways of collaborating or integrating or improving the relationship between those standards.
Yeah, David, I dug up a quick couple references while we were talking because I know I had seen some stuff in the Trust Over IP Foundation where we talked about it. And it was concepts of headless authentication and ways to tie in the trust anchor that tie back to FIDO 2. So yeah, it's very, to my knowledge, it's very doable.
Yeah.
Michael, did you want to bring a perspective to what's going on?
I'm just going to say, I mean, we are developing a mobile app actually in Cameroon right now, and looking across, sharing that into Uganda, Rwanda, Malawi, etc. And the problem is that the actual phone penetration on average is 30% in Africa. There are pockets where it's very, very high, but it's not on average well penetrated yet.
So they have a rural bandwidth issue as well, right? Like just like America.
Well, it's in Cameroon, 70% are rural.
Yeah, but in the urban environment, I mean, the population equally is it mostly now urban or rural or mixed or?
It's mostly rural.
Mostly rural.
70% rural.
So one of the things, Dave, we're working on here that I'm not sure how much you know about is we're working at the crossroads of all of the different social and health and justice and education and public safety sectors in terms of, safety, well-being, health, thriving, equity, all the issues of how does government and industry serve people better? Because we serve everybody in this country, and there's got to be a better way to do it because the technology sucks, and everybody knows it, and people are spending ginormous amounts of money, and things come down to, if we can get a couple of things right or take out some friction, then that creates a positive spiral, right? So we can turn it around, and that accelerates faster than linearly, as we just learned from the viruses. So we got to be agile. We got to be able to address change at the speed of light or whatever we're talking about. So a lot of the representation on this call comes from the health and human services space, education space, justice space, those kinds of things. Within government, within private sector, within philanthropy, a whole variety of different people who have actually been working together, sort of thinking through a lot of the problems that systems have, little counties or cities or states or the federal government have in terms of actually connecting services, sharing data about people, personal health information or personal PII or PHI kind of information. Huge challenge, right? Giant kind of thing that everybody's trying to get their arms around, even on the EHR side and Karen Alliance. It's big enough on the healthcare side. Well, we have focused on also the other sides, probably 80% of the equation, which has to do with social services and education services and probation and social services and housing and food and WIC and all of those things that people are in greater and greater need for in this country, no less in Cameroon, also in Cameroon. And a lot of that, I mean, there's giant issues, but there's giant resources that are, if we can just move them in a little more positive direction, we create some momentum. And right now is that opportunity to have momentum, right? It's this year, next year, before the world changes again. And so what one of the things we identified after a couple of years of actually working together to sort of try to refine what it is we could do as an organization, as a collaborative, a very sort of agile collaborative it's been built over the last couple of years. And as a result of that process, over COVID, actually, we met for almost 8 months, groups about 150 people. Six things came out in terms of structural changes that we could make. What could this group actually do? Not just recommend that others do. A lot of recommendations out there, but what could we actually potentially do that would have consequential impact on the field of health and human services? Audacious goal. And people stood up and they worked really hard to sort of think about these things in terms of social factors and economic factors and private, all the different complexities that go into this. Anyway, 6 things came out of that process. And one of the things that we've really kind of focused on is the whole issue of privacy and informed consent at the user interface level. So how do you bring that ability for you to say, use my data? I trust you to use my data. Help me get better. Help me to get moving along. Help me get my kids on the right path. Help me do that. Right now, it's freaking impossible to help people help themselves because the dissonance is so loud, and the inability, and the passwords on top of it, right? So we're trying to create actually a utility around being able to demonstrate how you could collect and obtain consent and revoke consent in response to regulatory, very serious regulatory kinds of environments, both within education and healthcare and social services and justice. And so we're about to go do this in a couple of places. We've been sort of ginning it up, so to speak, and we're focusing in on a couple of locations that are actually federally funded from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation and other federal agencies who are trying to, Karen is kind of connected to a lot of the efforts that are focused on data interoperability and standards within healthcare. Social services, they don't do so well, right? So we bring a social service, and I think of many of the people on these calls that have been involved with us, is to come at the challenge of data interoperability and information sharing, as well as from a consumer perspective. That's my background. But how do we do that within government across sectors in a way that actually respects people, creates the trust so they can say, yes, help me. And so we've got places, one in New York, one in New Jersey, we're talking to other places. But at the front end of that is creating a utility that you could engage with securely to say, here's a health, here's an education, here's a behavioral health, legal agreement that says, I give you my consent to share this information with the people who have access to it. And I trust that you can manage who has access to my information. So we're at that verge of that conversation where this is sort of in many ways the juncture between that. So that's why we're so excited to have you come and talk, because it seems like this is a hard space, and it's a really hard problem that really affects millions and hundreds of millions of people, literally, and trillions of dollars in our economy. And I think that I'm excited to bring more sort of awareness to this as we move forward in our work. And I'm sure folks on the call here are sort of thrilled to see where you're at on this. I don't know how many people put your name into the chat if you've seen this before. Let me ask that, because one of the things we do is we try to connect the dots between different sectors and different domains and different programs across different agencies. So the complexity of the problems are incredibly enormous. All right, Kay knows. Do you know Kay Chopper?
Yes, I do.
Greetings. Anyway, so I'm just professing my tremendous interest in this as well. So, especially when you mentioned GDPR in one of your slides, which is obviously in California, one of the areas we're working closely more and for a long time has been in California, in the Department of Health and Human Services, and how they're trying to integrate across the entire state now and be able to put together very ambitious plans under some new legislation. AB 133 actually that just got signed and is talking about connecting all of the services, all the healthcare services through a very aggressive timetable as well. So anyways, consent is the middle of that. So how do you manage it? How do you deal with the legal aspects of it? How do you customize that to every region, every state that has different laws? Everybody's got the same federal law, but every state has more intense and different laws and all sorts of quirky things. But can you have, here's the question to you. As you think about the field and the integration, all on the consumer side, so much of it on the industry side, people always say, how do we bring that to government? How do we bring from government, how do we bring that innovation and that agility into government? And it's hard to do that. So the question is, how do we create a front end that looks accessible to people regardless of what area of the law you're entering it, and have a configurable backend that would say, here's the policies, the rules, the regulations, the models, the tools, the architectures that are driving this community, this state, this community, this county, this state, this region, this nation. So how can you expand it so that you can actually manage consent both locally and with the right protections more broadly than that? But how do hospitals connect with all the community-based organizations and all the schools and the justice and emergencies? So how do you see this intersecting with the work that you're doing and the people that you're thinking about?
So the short answer, I'd say, is that it's a little out of Fido's remit.
Of course.
It's funny though, because personally, I've had direct involvement with some of this stuff over the years. So I'm very familiar with the challenges. I have no answer for it because it's a stunningly hard problem. I was directly involved with the W3C's P3P work some years ago. And then just a few years back, I actually was on contract to Cantera as editor of their consent receipt work.
Oh, cool.
So, you know, yeah, I'm very familiar with the challenges that you're trying to face, and yeah, it's a nasty knot to try and unravel. And cutting it through with a sword just won't do it.
Well, maybe we can make it a little easier for people to be comfortable with actually using their biometrics or their tools or their devices. You know, the concentration of smartphones in cities where we're working is probably 99%.
Well, I think where Fido does come in though is it ideally raises consumer confidence.
Right.
So the greater trust they have in the systems they're working with, then the easier it is to get them to agree to other things. How that's presented, you know, that's somebody else's problem. But you know, having them believe that yes, my information will be safe because it's really hard for someone to hack my account now.
Right.
That will go a long way to making the next step more agreeable to the consumer, which is a necessary part,
Yeah.
right?
So I have a consumer research background from years of working at Kraft Foods, and I've tried to bring in attitude and usage studies into social services, and found them to be incredibly valuable because the government's blind to that kind of research generally. And human-centered design and the kind of stuff now that, of course, technology companies are quite adept at has begun to penetrate. So that idea of being able to create that kind of interface, but to know from actual hearing it from people and adapting it is what we want to be able to bring to this table, because that kind of good, for want of a better slogan, for the good housekeeping seal of you can trust this, right? Because people want to trust their information. They want us to share their information. And in fact, they're incensed when they find out that we're not sharing the information. And it explains why they've had to give their information 10 times. And they're
Drives me nuts.
And that's why people hate government, because they think that it's government's doing it, whereas it's the lawyers. So we'll just blame the lawyers. So ultimately, I jest, but in fact, being able to use NIST standards, being able to show a good housekeeping, and being able to get and revoke consent allows the lawyers to step back and breathe a little bit, right? And so if we can integrate synthetic data to prove this out, which some of the folks on this call are working with, we can gain the trust of the attorneys and the Office of Civil Rights, which will be incredibly valuable. And in the political environment we live in, trust in government is really important. And if we don't have that, we can't deliver services.
So unfortunately, I need to go now. I don't know about Christina's time. Maybe she's got a few more minutes to answer more questions, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. If anyone wants to follow up with me, I'm david@fidoalliance.org. Feel free to hit me with any questions, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, David.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Stick around for a couple more minutes, but I've got to jump on the same call that David's going to right now.
All right. Well, I'll just hand you the mic and love you to hear kind of what your response, what your thoughts are to today's conversation.
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting conversation. It's great to see the engagement and the interest that people have in the topic. I know that, you know, when I think about what we've really been focusing on over the last few years, it's been largely driven by financial services, you know, another industry vertical that's sort of very sensitive to these topics and is highly regulated. And so we've had a lot of engagement around some of the issues and challenges that the financial services industry are focused on. And I think really now, clipping at the heels of financial services is healthcare. We're hearing a lot more conversations around healthcare generally, and the things that need to be done to address some of these issues. You know, we're talking a little bit about the sort of the underserved. I speak to a lot of like-minded organizations who are looking to try and address those challenges of identity proofing for people that don't necessarily have birth certificates or any kind of form of identification. And so I think all of these topics, you know, further compounded by the pandemic, are really, really important in today's world. And you know, it's really encouraging to see everybody here and other organizations that I talk to really focused on addressing some of these issues and thinking about it on a global level, and inclusive level as well, sort of thinking about it, not just the problems we have here in the US, but in other parts of the world as well. So I find the conversation really encouraging, and we're happy to be here today and engage. And huge thanks to David, who was able to cover the presentation and talk about the details, as well as some of the operational aspects of the Alliance. So thanks everybody for listening.
Appreciate the time. You'll be hearing from us. We're like, kind of like a bad rash. We never, once you get associated with this stuff, it's hard to be removed. So
we'd be happy to come back and talk again, give you an update in a few months, and we've made a little bit of progress, and you know, share the information that we're able to, and anything we can do to help you in your efforts as well. We'd be happy to support that work that you're doing.
One quick question: Are you familiar with the Healthcare IT Association HIMSS?
Yes.
Do you ever chance going to those? Do you ever go to those conferences? Or, you know, people in the organization have been there?
Yeah, me personally no, but we have had presence there in the past, and we do pay attention to what's going on. And if there's a relevant, if there's something that we're doing that's relevant that might be meaningful to that particular conference, we definitely reach out to them and make sure that we were included somehow, some way.
Oh, that's great. Good. Maybe you will. Some of the folks here will actually be presenting at the HIMSS conference. I think it's in March and in Florida. Have I got that right?
Yep. Yeah, that's correct.
Actually, specifically on this topic of consent and e-consent, and how does this all relate? So actually, there's actually a good linkage with FIDO, Ed, in terms of, especially if there's a HIMSS connection point. Right. Another node there.
Yeah, that's something else, you know, when I was thinking about what you're doing, there's a link there to financial services as well, you know, and this whole concept of non-repudiation in the health in the financial services industry, where there's an effort there to figure out how to use FIDO to provide informed consent effectively, so that people making transactions can't go back at a later date and say, well, I didn't do that transaction. Because there's an actual authentication step there that proves that they actually did it. So there's kind of a link there, I think, in terms of how we might connect the dots between what we're already talking about in the financial services industry and what we might think about from a healthcare perspective as well.
Yeah,
that's a
Jim
good point, Christina. It would be important to learn about that. You know, important for us to learn that.
Yeah.
No sense reinventing something that's already being invented.
Right. And from a FIDO perspective, you know, we think about things from, okay, what's the most secure we need, and we can go from there, and you can have a sliding scale of security. And depending on what you're trying to do, obviously healthcare is up there with financial services. You choose the level of security that you're looking at. And David touched on that when he was talking about our certification programs as well. But definitely we can, as we sort of figure that out, we'll can definitely keep you updated on what we're thinking there.
Yeah, Jim points out that actually FIDO supports a consent receipt of sorts. which is like a sent mail receipt. Perfect for that. That's great.
Yeah, I said that because David mentioned working on the consent receipt project in Kentera, and Kay and I are very familiar with that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, all good. It sounds wonderful. Glad we had the opportunity to get to know you, and certainly seems like there's a number of many sort of vectors of overlap. You know, just the thing that came to mind here is oftentimes I've heard over the years that I've talked to people about this work, they say, well, you know, I have my ATM card and I can get money anywhere. And if we could just get as secure as money, I'd be great. You know, I'd be fine. Think of it. We put a PIN number into a machine in anywhere in the world, and we're happy to put in 4 numbers. So I don't know. I think you've got the evidence. Let's just use it, right?
Yeah, it's all based on international standards. And, you know, that's really where we're focusing, figuring out the security, the usability, and the interoperability. And so the three areas that are really important. And then figuring out, in our case, as FIDO, from authentication and the identity work that we're looking at, is how to make sure that it's relevant across industry verticals. Yeah. So that's what's really important here right now, I think, with this conversation, is making sure that we as FIDO understand what the industry needs, the healthcare industry, and are applying what we're thinking about today with what you all need to meet your objectives. Yeah. It's a perfect time as the part of the government, actually the part that's the Office of National Coordinator and others who are sort of trying to define healthcare policy, and along with its social care policy as well, although they don't really want to own that part of it yet. We're forcing them to sort of bring it along as they create the infrastructure for the healthcare industry, or the disease care, I might say, industry, as well as the pharmaceutical industry. So there's a lot of work that actually has continued since the former administration, that kept the wheels moving along in terms of data interoperability and app and modernization. And people, I think, have kept up, you know, reasonably well over COVID as well, I might say. So it's coming together now in a way that it feels like there could be a lot of real positive momentum over the next couple of years, especially as infrastructure gets built and bands, you know, 5G. Everybody got their 5G phones working today. You know, when do they turn it on for us? Not on the plane, I guess. You have to turn your phones off. Anyway, that's great. We can keep talking all afternoon. We're not even into overtime yet. So this group is notoriously known for just staying on until the last person drops off, says, I gotta go have dinner. So we'll mercifully thank you for your participation and move on. Yeah, thanks for the invite. I will drop now, and have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Anybody still left on the call? Oh my God, a lot of people here. Yay, good to see everybody. Well, any thoughts? That was exciting. I don't know about you guys, but I just think about not having a password for hallelujah. That gives you back like 10 points on the day, you know?
But how am I going to keep my old dog in my memory if I don't have to put her name and 47 unrelated characters into my password all the time?
I couldn't get into Apple TV the other night. I just threw the goddamn phone against the wall and said, I know I got the password somewhere. I got to go right downstairs to my office and look on the sticky note on my phone.
Think about all those poor people though who've lost their Bitcoin passwords.
Is there no way to get them back?
No way at all. They're not recoverable.
If I no longer have to play tech support for my parents and their passwords, what am I going to do with my time? Right?
I don't know. So Daniel had a really interesting call last week that one of my CBO organizations referred this consultant from MITRE to me, who has a contract from CDC to talk to CBOs and healthcare organizations, HIEs, whatever, about how to best or to begin integrating social determinants information into healthcare data that CDC works with. And I was just so pleased that they've actually got it enough on their radar that they hired a consultant to go out and start to do a whole bunch of interviews and bring information to them about this.
The CDC is?
Yeah.
Is there an office in the CDC, or is it somebody?
I don't know. I'd have to follow
Part-time
up
job?
with these guys. They were going to send me some confirmation stuff afterwards.
Awesome.
Yeah, it is. I don't know which office it is. I look forward to hearing from Kathy. I know MITRE folks who are working in CDC, but the MITRE folks who are working at CDC are on the epidemiological COVID response. This is a separate one that's the community response that Kathy's talked to. And then I work with another group that is international outreach. So.
And this group was specifically focused on how to integrate social determinants information. And how it can be used by CBOs and by healthcare organizations and all. I was really pleased to see that that consciousness exists now.
Yeah. So, and but doesn't who else is connected to MITRE? I mean, we were talking to them last year a bunch through some contacts, right? When we were trying to see if we could expedite some procurement within, from agency to agency to get stuff done. And MITRE was an important player in that. But something else that was connected there. There was something else that was connected. Oh, yeah, the NIH and the work that Brian and others have been doing on the ontologies work. There's also been interest there as well, which is kind of also important to bring that in. So that'll be excellent to see that moving forward. Kate, anything going on that you can share with us, or what you're thinking about this kind of conversation? I know you and Jim are deeply involved in this work.
Yes, well, as they were talking, I as you know, I was sending you private little notes here that I really should probably try to bring information to this group about the work that Kantara does. As David said, he knows me and Christina, they know me pretty well. And they do specifically authentication. And theirs, of course, is around basically like hardware, right? And the lab testing that they do. Whereas the assurance program that we do is with third-party assessors, but it's not the same as just testing your equipment, right? So we, in our assurance program, first of all, it's based on the NIST standard of 863 version 3, which there's a version 4 coming out, we anticipate this year, which I sort of hope will embrace. It already talks about biometrics in the NIST standard, but we're hoping it will embrace even more modern technologies like artificial intelligence and so on, but which is focused on identity assurance, on authentication assurance, and on federation assurance. And the certifications that we do look at the whole process. So they look at, does the technology do all the things like what FIDO is looking for? And do the governance and the policies also meet the standards? So it's not just my technology can do this, but I have privacy policies in place so that my technology is used correctly, right? So there's a whole nother piece of our accreditation program. And historically, I don't know how many of you are familiar, back in the day of FICAM, historically, Kantara worked with the federal government to create this accreditation program, essentially, to be able to put together criteria and be able to assess if people met the NIST standards. And of course, the federal government mandates that all federal agencies can only use identity providers, credential service providers who meet these assurance levels. And we're at the moment, we are the only ones who provide that certification. But just ours goes a little bit beyond the capability of the technology to ensure that the governance, that sort of how you implement the solutions that you have, are also meeting all of those important standards. Is that helpful? I don't know. So that's the kind of stuff that we're doing. And as I didn't realize David had actually essentially worked for Kantara, even though it was as a contractor. I didn't realize his background with the consent receipt, which is a specific work group. And I was thinking that it probably would make sense for me to have like the chair of that work group come and maybe talk to this group. It might be helpful. Some of the consent receipt work that's already been done. So.
Super helpful. In fact, the whole idea of a kind of a consent receipt or a NIST standard, one might say, as exemplified in a receipt of sorts, an authenticated, authorized, recognized receipt, was first sort of conceptualized in San Diego County a bunch of years ago with their Live Well and Connect Well programs. So hypothesized a lot of that. The person who was the architect of that, one of the people who was the architect of that, and IBM was part and parcel of that as well. Really asked that question: if you could, how do you move away from the paradigm of approving something did not happen, to a high enough level that an attorney would say, okay, so what if you, as opposed to the negative, actually created a targetable standard that says, if I reach that level of security, then I'm okay sharing information about somebody, their conditions. We're not talking about opening up their bank account necessarily, but how do you share their health information or their social information, really personal stuff. And there is no standard, but it sounds like from today's conversation that we're getting very close to that with the kind of authentication through biometrics. I didn't understand the two other places, the other two ways of actually confirming it. But if we can get there, that solves so many of the legal issues that allows us to actually make progress. It's not the answer, but it removes and reduces the friction of actually moving data. Let them move the data, like what Kathy's trying to do and Paul and others are trying to do in New Jersey and New York around this consent work, so they can move the data unencumbered by not knowing whether or not they've got an active consent that addresses all of the particular programs that somebody might be involved with, right? That are highly protected. We're right at that inflection point. I would propose we're right at that. I don't want to be hysterically optimistic, but it feels like it's, there's a connecting point here between these things.
And I'll just offer, we're behind the times between ISO standards and NIST standards. At this point, when organizations don't share data, it's just an excuse. The federal certification requirements for federal systems set up information sharing agreements at the classified level all the time. There's no reason you can't do it. And it's even with lawyers, the understanding of HIPAA or the attitude to which they approach HIPAA is in many cases wrong-headed from the begin with. So the organizations intentionally try and prevent from sharing data.
Surprise.
Well, I think that Jim makes a good point, because for like our work, I don't think Kantara is as well known in the healthcare community, but all the places that Jim just described are very well known, right? And the companies that come to us for, like TEFCA mandates IAL2 and AAL2, which is Identity Assurance Level 2 and Authentication Assurance Level 2 accreditation for providers. And they are basically, in TEFCA, it tells healthcare providers, when you get these credential service providers, these identity providers, whatever, they must be, right? You need to have them accredited to these levels. And the federal government mandates it. And so it's used in all the exact same kinds of things that Jim has just described. And so it's interesting that, but the healthcare realm is kind of its own world in and to itself, I think. And, you know, and I appreciate that organizations like you and others, like the Karen Alliance, they're doing a pilot. I'm sure you know about all that. And that pilot, they're going to be requiring the companies participating. Uh-oh, I'm frozen. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
You know, to go through the assurance program, to make sure that they're accredited at those levels as well, because that's where you get the protections. And again, there are lots of technical solutions. And I think one of the reasons the government has mandated that kind of assurance level, the one that we do, is because of what I said before. It requires that you have policies and governance in place. It's required that you have taken a look at and assessed the risk and come up with a policy to mitigate that risk. So it's kind of a combination of technology solutions, but also recognizing, you know, people run the technology. So they need to have the guidance so that they are using things appropriately and you don't get unintended consequences. How's that for?
That was great because you said exactly what we need to say here. And, you know, part of the issue is that unless there are mandates, we get lawyers' interpretations, right? And that's actually what we need from the system is mandates. And this is where we started this a while ago. I said, you know, the mandate was meaningful use, right? And it wasn't sharing. If it had been sharing, this would have been done a long time ago.
Yeah. Just for the record, I am a lawyer and maybe there are others on the call, but I can appreciate that you all are frustrated with the profession, but I'm not taking it personally.
Some of my best friends are lawyers.
I appreciate what you're saying, Paul. I think it's really true.
But the question still remains is how to define what that mandate is in healthcare is hard enough, but move into the human side of the programs. That's a governance question of another order, which is, so do we need to be at 7 Sigma? You know, yeah, maybe if you're Fort Knox, you know, or you're a bank. In terms of me as a consumer, are we engineering to a standard that is only going to happen once in a, you know, 100 million or 200 million times? You know, how accurate do we need to be, right?
Well, that's a valid question, Daniel, and it comes up in our HL7 identity working group, because the argument is, you know, you maybe need to be an IL 1.7 to be at the registration desk, but I want an IL level 3 before I cut your leg off.
Right.
So, you know, if anything else, I personally, even in a classified world, can't think of authentication requirements where there are life and death requirements to have exactly the right person. Whether it's, you know, medication prescriptions, a procedure, it has to be perfect. You have to know you've got that right person. And there's many other administrative functions that don't require that. So that question about 6 Sigma, as a matter of fact, if we have 6 Sigma processes at 99.99767% accuracy for patient matching, 320 patients out of 1 million still die. Is that okay? And who makes that call?
It's a lot better than what we're doing now.
Yeah, but the lawyers don't stomach it. No offense, Kay.
No, that's a very tough question. You know, that analogy is, you know, would we tolerate that? Would we tolerate the loss of planes? Reverse it. Would we tolerate the loss of planes as we have accuracy in medical diagnosis or errors? No, right? There'd be planes dropping out of the sky every minute, something like that. The number of people would be injured as a result of that.
Right, but we have a mandate to deliver care to a homeless indigent person that walked in the door, and we don't even know their name and they don't speak English.
Right. That's why I love, you know, the whole question of biometrics. You know, your iris and your I love that, but it raised a lot of, I don't know what people believe around that, right? I don't know what our consumers believe around that. That's what's one of the interesting things.
Actually, there's an FQHC that we work with that went to iris scans,
Cool.
probably 10 or 12 years ago.
Cool.
And they're, you know, in the middle of the Bronx. They've got a lot of undocumented people, and their patients are fine with it.
Not surprising.
And iris scans are 99 point something or other percent, one of the most effective biometrics to use. And so they're default. I have a friend of mine who's got a company with a funding for the Gates Foundation to do birth attestation certificates. So fundamentally establishing birth attestations for folks who don't have them, and uses iris scanning, and then he puts it into the decentralized ledger technology that I've presented before, and only that individual can get back to it.
Love it.
And there are lots of instances of this, right? Because we also have a transitional housing place in Upper Manhattan that in order to get in and to go to your room, you have to scan, they have iris scans.
That's a great example, Paul, because Matt and I were having a little side chat conversation about this, and I was really worried about paranoia in that population. But if you're seeing it happen, I mean, there may be some people who might have that, but it sounds like it's overall successful.
I mean, it's really an example of physical safety, right? And not only this kind of, you know, record safety, right?
So that's really wonderful that on the authentication component, biometrics can take you a long way. What that is not solving for, that Karen is trying to get to, is the proof, getting a universal identifier that's associated with that authentication that's used across practitioners, right? So that if Hackensack Meridian is working with one that doesn't use biometrics, you can do the patient matching, right? And without that agreed upon identifier across organizations, the mandate that Paul is talking about, right? You only solve part of the problem, right? And you still have the issue that Jim's talking about of, am I operating on the right person? Because you're fetching in information from other systems that may not have the same degree of confidence.
And there's nothing that stops an HIE or a QHIN from implementing universal patient identifiers relative to their population base. All of this talk about universal patient identifiers only points to legislation, section 510, that affects HHS. But if the Bronx Rio or Sequoia declared that in the midst of doing things, or MyHIN, and said, we're going to have a universal patient identifier for everyone within this health information exchange, that's perfectly legal.
Yeah, I mean, the private sector can come into agreement on a standard, and boom, there's nothing, it's a collective action problem. It's not that it's impossible for the private sector to do it without government, but with a mandate, it would be a lot easier.
Yeah, it adds a whole layer to us. I mean, we have a master patient index that gives everybody a unique identifier within us, but we don't do primary person identification verification. And so, and particularly when we're taking data from multiple sources and linking those people across the data, unless everybody's using the same standards for identity verification at the hospitals and the doctor's offices and everything, it's useless, means nothing. We change MPIs all the time. We split people, we join people, we take the twins apart and put them back together. So I get your point, Jim, but I think it's really hard to implement at this larger, data aggregator level, because we don't have direct access to the person.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know that their data is coming to us. There's no.
Are you able to?
Yeah.
Are you able to get information on the level of identity proofing that was done? Right.
Yes. Yes.
When it was, when it was sent to you?
Part of our whole onboarding process with an organization is to understand their identity verification process for their patients. And we even, when we have questions about whether to link somebody whose addresses or names or birth dates are similar, we will often go to the HIM department at the source and ask them to show us what they use to create this person and assign their medical record. And that, you know, so we'll often go back to them to get their primary validation information so we can make a determination of whether it really is the same person when we're trying to link somebody or not. So we know.
Kathy, you're exactly right. I didn't mean to suggest it was easy, just that it's legal, but you're exactly right, folks.
Yeah.
Do
Lots of things are legal.
are hospital systems able to request from you, like, I only want a linked records if they reach, if it's coming from an organization that reaches identity assurance level 2? Are they able to request like less information but more certain information essentially? Or do you essentially make those decisions and then they're linked?
We make
there's
those
one record
decisions based on input from our HIM committee. So we basically have a committee open to all of our members that approves all of our linkage algorithms for automatic linking and also approves all of our rules for manual linking. And so they all know how it's done. We have not necessarily looked at the source's identity proofing standards in terms of comparing them to the kind of thing you're asking about, but we do look at their processes. And that's something we should probably look at trying to standardize more. But once we link somebody, anybody looking at their data is looking at everything we have.
Got it.
An interesting idea.
Because there might be organizations like CBOs requesting data that, you know, there might be not the implications of getting a bad record or not, you know, you're going to kill a patient, right?
Right.
Necessarily. So the risks may not be the same for certain organizations requesting. Whereas if you're doing a colonoscopy or, you know, cutting off a leg.
Well, every single healthcare provider institution I know relies on their own identity verification, not mine.
Yeah.
And they will take information they get from the RIO as additional information that they then may try to confirm.
Yeah.
But they're not using, I mean, and we've been told this time and time again in our situations, it's extremely rare that they will use HIE data for life-threatening situations. Unless they've got somebody, you know, presenting in the ED and they need blood and we tell them they're no negative, that they'll take because they don't really, you know, have a choice. But if we tell them AB positive, they still might go with a universal donor blood anyway. Because, and we've, over the years, I mean, I cannot tell you how many times we've gotten the question about provider liability on use of HIE data. And, you know, all we're able to tell them is, well, you know, there is absolutely zero case law on providers having been sued, at least in New York State, for doing something based on data from an HIE. You know, they've looked at all the cases filed. They've seen absolutely nothing that was filed that, you know, basically said HIE gave me bad data and so I did something and that was, you know, that was wrong.
But to Matt's point, you know, what is the, you know, how do we segment the risk, right? So that's why the healthcare standard is useful but not adequate in the social space because it's too high a bar in some areas. I don't think it's that. I think people can make good judgments on what's accessible, what's acceptable, and what do you need? sometimes you don't even need the info. You just need to know if it's yes or no, some ways. So I think it's really promising if we can adjust our expectations, again, that we're not taking money out of the ATM, right? That, we trust that. And we're not making, sort of, again, there's the whole advanced directive question that we've been, that has been part of the scan, and was a big part of it was great, but that's not what we're, you got to do that, right? You got to get that absolutely right. But we're talking about people's lives and complexity. That's why the front end of, actually getting the consent from so there's a ubiquitous way to get the consent and manage that is so important. We just had an amazing 2-hour session today with Solano County, which is one of the 5 Kresge funded technical assistance programs that we've just given our ITCC training for the last couple of months. So everybody had like 4 webinars and took them through it, and we were providing consultation as kind of a capstone to each of the 5 sites. And so we were just talking with Solano today, the issues of exactly what we're talking about here is coming together at the county level in relationship to this giant statewide new effort, AB 133, which is post whole person care. It's beyond it. It's the next 1115 waiver across the entire state. They set a June 30th, 2022 deadline to get a common consent form authorized and applicable at a data sharing agreement across the entire state. Talk about chutzpah.
For every type of data or for healthcare?
All Medicaid, anything related to Medicaid.
Oh, okay. Well, New York's working on that too.
Across the entire state.
One consent across the entire state. All current and future treatment providers and health plans.
By what day? When do they got to get that done?
We're in proof of concept stage now. They're hoping to implement at the end of 2022.
Very interesting connection.
We have many reservations about it, but we've been told that's where we're going.
Yeah, so I set that assumption as that deadline is not even just put it off to the side. But the fact that there's energy going into this, and all the counties are being, in some ways, subjected to trying to figure it out, how they're going to adopt Medicaid managed care, who's going to take all of the information, and the county information is coming together across all those counties. I'm sure similarly in New York as well. And then that rolls up. I don't know what the roll up is, but they're all kind of doing it. It seems like many of them are doing it on their own, of course, and that the state wants them to go in one direction, but I'm not sure how far along the roadmap they have actually gotten. It doesn't sound like, it sounds like it's just starting up. They just passed the legislation in December or something like that. So hit the ground running. Anyway, interesting sort of corollary that's happening there. So the application, one of the things, just 2 quick notes that I'll share, and then I run out of words here. One is, so we're having conversations across California in the network. There's this thing called CalAIM, which is, I said, the big initiative across the state, because I want to see if we can get one of them into a pilot, one of the pilots. And I'm talking to actually John Ohanian, who now leads their sort of statewide data integration office. Was formerly in San Diego, he was the CEO of the 211 program. Anyway, and so that's happening, that conversation is happening, and I'm looking to generate more, sort of more momentum around that and the interest around that. And then next week I was invited to participate in a roundtable from HHS on related kinds of things. So they're having a roundtable with Children's Bureau and folks from HHS and other folks. And they said, come and talk to us about what's happening in data interoperability and consent, and how's it dealing with, children and families. Actually, it's mostly organized under the Children's Bureau. And so there's a lot of, about 20 people will be at that event, I think, including Chapin Hall, including various representatives from the Casey world, who sort of run those organizations. So there's a great intersection there as well in terms of bringing this stuff up and continuing that engagement at the at the federal level. And the Children's Bureau Associate Commissioner Asia, who was in New York City, is the key enabler right now. So she gets what we're doing, and she's we're trying to sort of set up with the state at the appropriate times, so we don't freak out the state people, but being able to have a federal, state, county, local implementation in a couple of places. So they're interested in that. So we get to push that vision forward next week a little bit more, see where that goes. So that's what I got. Yeah, it's great. It's pretty awesome. Simeon, greetings. Do you guys know Simeon? Paul, Kathy?
No.
Simeon, would you be so kind as to say a few words? He's a New Jersey guy.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I've been listening here. It's a very interesting presentation, week after week. So just absorbing all the language, the knowledge, and yeah, it's definitely very insightful.
What's front of mind for you for New Jersey Inc.? Most of the people we communicate with is like Mike Relly.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I said, what's front of mind, or what is your main focus or concern within New Jersey Inc.? I see you on the calls, but I haven't heard much on what you're working on personally.
Well, right now is the launch of the NJ Inc. and the making sure everything works on the back end with the case management. So we are, basically live, started little by little with the pilot, and next week is the official launch.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.